very much. Hi, everyone. Many apologize for my very bad English. I will do my best to talk slowly and more or less clearly. Yes, today I will talk about the least renowned case of Freudian history that is to say, the case of Anna Freud, who was analyzed for years by her father. As you know, especially in England, Anna Freud reigned for decades over the international psychoanalytic movement, validating and ostracizing great authors such as Lacan, Melanie Klein, and others. But apropos of her analysis with Freud, she began at the age of 23, which lasted from 1918 to 1925. I would like to point out that it was in 1919 that Freud published the case of female homosexuality, case keeping maybe some relation with the case of Anna Freud. But deep down, to be clear, the hypothesis I will defend here is that several theoretical points Freud would never have existed without Anna Freud's analysis. I believe that is a very important point. And maybe the daughter taught her father a great deal, particularly regarding female sexuality. To state things clearly from the beginning, it seems evident that the Anna Freud case served as the foundation for the Freud's development of his theory of fantasy, namely in his text, A Child is Being Beaten, published precisely in 1919. That's why we will explore today, A, what evidence supports this claim, and B, most importantly, what exactly is Freud's seminal text on fantasy, A Child is Being Beaten, and how we should read it according to me. More specifically, how does the Anna case help us clarify and understand this famous text by Freud, A Child is Being Beaten? Because this text is often read and misunderstood. Excuse me, it is because this text is often poorly read and misunderstood. In concrete terms, we will uncover why it is incomplete and opaque at the first reading, and there are a lot of reasons for that. This text is often poorly read, in particular by Lacanian analysts who read it as it was a kind of metaphysical text, while in fact this is a very clinical one. So what about that? Quite simply, the case Freud used as an example for this text, A Child is Being Beaten, is the case of his own daughter, Anna Freud. And for this, not only I will show you why Anna is the case behind A Child is Being Beaten, thanks to her correspondence with Lou and Salome, but also to correctly understand Freud's text, we will examine a lecture by Anna Freud gave in 1922 when she became a member of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, lecture titled Beating Fantasies and Daydreaming. There are different translations, but it's more or less that. Because it's in German, the original talk. This is the text that truly helps us understand A Child is Being Beaten, because Anna Freud speaks about her own case, that is to say, the very case behind a Freud text. Anna Freud underwent two periods of analysis with Freud. with interruption caused by Freud's illness. Because in 1923, he underwent his first surgery for his cancer. Let's now discuss Anna Freud's first analysis with her father, which began in 1918. Why did Freud take his daughter into analysis? That is the question. Because Anna, she was exhibiting symptoms. She was struggling with her studies and couldn't figure out how to orient herself in life. It's also important to note that thanks to her father, she formed a friendship with Lou Andrea Salome. And this friendship plays a background role in Anna's analysis with Freud in such a way that we can consider Anna's letters to Lou Andrea Salome like a kind of report of her own analysis, a kind of compte rendu in French. Because we have in French the complete correspondence between Anna Freud and Lou Andrea Salome, and I am not sure if it exists in English. I don't think so. It's a pity. Okay, let's approach this. Anna, what is her problem? She is paralyzed in her life and her activities. Paralyzed by what? By the existence of an almost constant fantasy activity that invites her mind and body. What kind of fantasy is it? They are stories she tells herself, narrative, that can sometimes last for hours. So a very symptomatic activity. Aside from that, she is alone, not in a relationship. She has very intimate female friendship, and basically, she's not very interested, in men. What are her stories, her fantasies? There are daydreams that always follow the same structure, the same storyline, the same pattern. It is the story of a boy, not a girl, but a 15-year-old boy, caught in various adventures and trials. Very quickly, this boy meets a man, an adult, who subjugates him, forces him to work, imprisons him, and probably beat him. But always, inevitably, and this is the climax of the story, this adult, this man, ends up forgiving him because boy always does something wrong, etc. So the adult eventually forgives him. And it's always when the adult forgives him that the story, the fantasy, brings the most psychological pleasure, and it can sometimes end in masturbation. Of course, you might ask, how do you know that Anna is talking about her own case? That she told herself these stories and ended up masturbating? The answer is because she said it herself, not in the public lecture, obviously. To understand all of this, we need to start from 3 texts. So it's a little bit complicated. You can read directly like that, a child has been beaten. 3 texts. A child is being beaten, obviously, by Freud. Fantasies, flagellation, and daydreaming, the lecture by Anna Freud. And finally, is useful, the letters from Anna to Lou Andrea Salome. You don't have to read all that. My question is, if you want to do a research about that, you need at least these 3 texts. As I said, you understand nothing about of Freud's A Child is being beaten if you don't read Anna Freud's lecture, which no one knows, obviously, fantasies of flagellation and daydreaming. In other words, within the two texts, Freud and Anna Freud, there is a kind of dialectical relationship where one completes the other's gasps, and so on. A child is being beaten, 1919. Lacan spoke about this text. He talked about it a lot, a great deal. Lacan discussed it to explain that is the prime that it is the prime example of fantasy in analysis, that we must understand how the unconscious fantasy corresponds to a phrase, a grammatical structure, in order to confirm Lacan's thesis that the unconscious is structured like a language, and so on and so forth. But what is never mentioned is that this fantasy is about what? About a masturbation. We are masturbating our minds by talking about fantasy structure like a language, but we miss the essential point, that is to say, a child is being beaten is an essay about a masturbatory activity, period. Point. It is a masturbatory activity in which the person becomes aroused, excited, by imagining that there are children being beaten by adults, with the particularity that after the orgasm, a feeling of guilt sets in for the person due to its obscenity. So the idea that from Freud that neurosis is a negative of perversion, in fact, pedophilic one. The fantasy in question is present, according to Freud, in 6 peoples, 4 women and 2 men. Another interesting element, these fantasies originate in school age, before the age of 6. Why is this important? Because we are at the beginning of the 20th century, and children are still being physically punished at school in such a way that when the child sees scenes of punishment at school, A, she is already familiar with them, and B, she feels disgusted by it because she doesn't like it. I say she because most of the people is the women. You see, to some extent there, the notion of jouissance in the Lacan sense. That is to say, on one hand, she likes it, on the other hand, she doesn't like it. Doesn't like it. This perturbates her. In a way, it is the same situation as when you act out a fantasy. You are often disappointed, isn't it? Why? Simply because the subject doesn't occupy the same position when it imagines versus when it acts out. It's a topologic issue. Good to know before, maybe. Here is the famous sentence of the fantasy, donc from Anna Freud. I don't know, a child is being beaten. That's all. 2 details. The beaten child is never the subject, and B, it's always boys. But Freud has another clarification. The one doing the beating would be the father of the girl. It is how Freud reconstructs the famous second phase of the fantasy, namely, I quote, I'm being beaten by the father, end of quote, which the subject never says. It's the Freud who supposes it. That's all. Now, Anna Freud. Let's turn our attention to her presentation on May 31, 1922, given to become a member of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. Like any lecture, it begins with the ladies and gentlemen, except that Anna Freud, 27 years old, reversed the order and says gentlemen and ladies on purpose, because the majority of the audience were men. Her father is present during the conference. She underwent 4 years of analysis with her father, with 5 sessions per week. Despite that, or thanks to that, she says, gentlemen and ladies. So you see, she wasn't too shy, finally. The title is Fantasies of Flagellation and Daydreams. Donc she says, the first thing she says is that her presentation owes a lot to Freud's article, A Child is Being Beaten. But she also adds that her speech owes a lot of a series of conversations with Lou Andrea Salome. That is a little bit strange statement in the sense of, on the one hand, her speech comes from the theoretical point of view of her father, but at the same time, the clinical case presented by her comes from a series of conversations with Lou Andrea Salome, while in fact she was in analysis with Freud. So it's a little bit, a little gap. I mean, she didn't say my speech owes a lot of the serious conversation with Freud, isn't it? In any case, it shows until what point there was a kind of triangulation in that analysis, a lateral transference of analysts call that, transférence latérale. Of course, Anna Freud presents a clinical case of another patient, a clinical case that is an example of the fantasy a child is being beaten. The case is focused of the importance of daydreams, daytime fantasies. So this is the case of a 15-year-old girl who, around the age of 5 or 6, constructs the following fantasy: some boy is being beaten by some adult, on the one hand. But on the other hand, you have to grasp that from adolescence, this patient begins to construct another fantasy activity, a secondary fantasy, so to speak, which she calls beautiful stories. Beautiful compared to other story a child is being beaten, which is not beautiful but ugly. So that is the point. You have two kinds of fantasies. Without this distinction, you don't really grasp the true message, unquote, of Freud's text about fantasy. I mean, you realize, reading Anna Freud's talk conference, the real structure of a child is being beaten, because Freud says that these two different levels of fantasy, but people don't see that. Strange stuff. I don't, it's like that. What is the story, the secondary fantasy invented in the adolescence by a girl who, when she was 5, imagined the scene a child is being beaten, so-called beautiful stories, is the following one. A teenager, a boy, not a girl, age 15, is taken prisoner by an adult. The adult punishes him, imprisons him, but finally forgives him. This is the key moment in the story. Sometimes the other story, a child is beaten, bursts in, and it ends in masturbation. But most of the time, there is no masturbation. With the beautiful stories, it's a asexual activity, in quote, asexual. While a child is beaten is with masturbation of the time. So you can grasp, you can see here two kinds of fantasies, very, very different. The first one in the petite enfance, in the childhood, very childhood, and the other one construct in the adolescence, adult epoch. Anna specifies all the people who appear as characters in the beautiful stories have a name, faces, and a personal history, which contrast, I quote, with the anonymity in The Child is Beaten, where we don't know who the beaten child is or who the adult doing the beating is. And adds, everything is copied as faithfully as possible from real life. It's a key point. The story is constructed by a whole series of transformation, but what is important is the monotony of his narrative, a narrative that is always the same. You probably know this, but Freud was the first to emphasize that in fantasies it's always the same story. So much so that both Freud and Lacan insist on this monotony. But for the subject, who imagine that is the ultimate pleasure, you see that boredom and pleasure are not always opposites. But listen carefully to this. The key to all of this, the gravitational point, if I might say, is that the beautiful story is directly inspired by real life, characters with first and last name, and it is also inspired by the ugly story at the same time. A child is being beaten. You see that is a little bit complex, stuff. Even more, the beautiful story is a kind of repression. I repeat, the beautiful story is a kind of repression of the fantasy a child is being beaten because it masked the ugly story, the obscene fantasy, in such a way that Anna calls it a kind of sublimation, so a repression, in fact. And the question that interests us is how beautiful stories is a sublimation, but at the same time, how these beautiful stories brings a pleasure comparable to the orgasm in the ugly story, except that is essentially as asexual, without sex. I want you to take a little reward now, because you tolerate me until this point. The reward is the following. One, the beautiful story, the sublimated product, the story copied from real life is what Lacan writes, borrowed subject lozenge A. I repeat, the beautiful story, the bullshit story, in fact, a sexual story, and so on, without guilty, and so on, the repression that of the other story, fantasy, is what Lacan calls borrowed subject lozenge A. So you cannot mix, confuse this notion of imaginary fantasy with the fundamental fantasy, that is to say, the ugly story, the childhood story, the perverse story that Lacan call, a fundamental fantasy. The first beautiful story is in harmony with the ego, while the second one is in contradiction with the ego. If you look at the symbol Barth subject lozenge A in the graph of the desire, you'll see that it on the same side as the ego, both in italics, because it is produced by the ego. Is what the ego uses to avoid being defeated by symbolic castration, if I can say like that. So the beautiful story is more or less what we can call the telenovelas or soap opera. It's a soap opera. She's very beautiful. She loves her fiancé, very handsome fiancé. They are very happy. But one day she discovered that she's cheating on her with her own sister. So next episode, the sister is pregnant with her fiancé baby, and so on and so forth. So that is more or less the Barth subject lozenge age. Pardon, excuse me. So very different that the fantasme fondamental, donc fundamental fantasy, and you don't have confused, excuse me, these two very different levels. After that, I will show you two schemas in order to better understand this aspect. But second point, because she says is in why I know that is the case of Anna, her case, because she says it in a letter to Lou Andrea Salome, where I quote Anna Freud, since I'm talking about daydreams, I must tell you a surprising story. My beautiful stories suddenly reappear last week. They rage on throughout the whole day. I was struck by the unchanged persistence, the strength, and the attraction of such a dream, excuse me, so much commented on, analyzed, published, and mistreated, as is the case with my daydream. This end of quote. This letter was written after the 1922 publication of Anna's lecture. So you see that this is her case, in fact. And after this letter, Anna wrote to Lou, I resume a bit of analysis with Papa, the reason being the resurgence of my daydreams, accompanied by the bodily intolerance towards fantasies of flagellation and their consequences, so masturbation, excuse me.
And its consequences, no?
Excuse me?
And its consequences. I just wanted to know what
Yeah, good. Yeah. So the conclusion of this first part is the following. The consequence to the first analysis of Anna was the article crucial text, a child is being beaten. That's why I consider that Anna teach her father about fantasy. I can continue on with a little bit aspect. The second analysis with Freud. You know, this second analysis is due to the resurgence of daydreams, as I said. And we can make the following observation. Just as Anna Freud's first analysis result in the writing of the text a child is being beaten, similarly, her second analysis led to the writing by Freud of another very important text of female sexuality, namely same psychical consequences of the anatomical distinction within the sexes, 1925. Okay, but that's not all. You have noted that not only did the first analysis result in a child is being beaten written by Freud, but it also led to the text Fantasies of Flagellation and Daydreams written by Anna. So the question is whether the second analysis, in addition to Freud's cited text, some psychical consequences, etc., also produced a text written by Anna. Perhaps it did, but it's a lost text. It is a 1925 lecture by Anna titled Jealousy and the Desire for Masculinity. Is clear? Despite this, there may be traces of Anna's Freud 1925 lecture, Jealousy and the Desire for Masculinity, in another article published in 1927, Contribution to the Theory of Child Analysis, where jealousy between siblings is a central theme. Everyone knows Anna's legendary jealousy of her sister Sophia, who died when she was still a young woman. So maybe another point, but long story short, one question. Can we state, as Rudinesco did, that Freud prevented the development of his daughter's sexuality, who was predestinated for homosexuality? For me, it's totally wrong. Simply because Anna spent her entire life with Dorothy Birmingham until the latter death. And secondly, because they all went on vacation together, Freud, Anna, Anna's girlfriend Dorothy, and so on and so forth. Maybe you think this is already crazy enough, this story, but in reality, the craziest part is yet to come. It's 1925. Anna continues her analysis with her father with 5 sessions per week, and nothing happens. Unquote. She keeps masturbating. She doesn't find a husband. She can't abandon her clitoris, etc. The analysis is stuck. Point. As you probably know, Freud was interested in occultism. He subscribes to an English spiritualist journal, very known, and one day in 1925, he read about the case of a professor, Murray, very known professor, who ran thought transmission sessions with his daughter. And so the father of psychoanalysis had no better idea than to engage in a spiritual seance session with Anna Freud and Ferenczi. Freud called Ferenczi, who left Budapest to come to Vienna, and all of this happened in February 15, 1925, a Sunday evening. Freud acted as the medium, and Anna was supposed to transmit thought that he, the medium Freud, had to guess. What exactly happened during this session, we don't know much, except what each of the 3 main character says in their letters, 3 participants. Ferenczi write in a circular letter, kind of group email, dated March 15, 1925, declaring, "It should interest you to know that we conduct a series of rather successful thought transmission experiment in Vienna with the professor and Miss Anna." End of quote. In Freud's letter dated March 15, 1925, he stated, "Ferenczi was with us on a Sunday. We discussed many things and conducted, the 3 of us, thought transmission experiment that were remarkably successful." No, rather successful, remarkably successful, especially the experiment where I myself played the role of the medium, subsequently completing my ideas in an analytical manner, and so on and so forth. While Anna Freud, on Wednesday, February 18, 1925, 3 days after the thought transmission experiment, Anna write to Lou. There are many topics in these letters that one could discuss in person, but which are impossible to address by letter. Perhaps the fault lies with the continuation of my analysis. Interesting. Because of it, and perhaps they are even encouraged by it, absurd things sometimes rise to the surface, things that I am much more used to paying attention to during extra analytic periods. I always feel the desire to talk about them with you. End of quote. What is my interpretation of all this? For me, it is clear that the thought transmission experiment is a kind of acting out of Freud, who doesn't know what to do with her daughter. Am I saying that his analysis failed? Not at all, because 2 things. A, Anna Freud becomes on the most known analyst in the world, and second, because 4 months after the thought transmission experiment, a century ago, she met for the first time Dorothy Burlingham, her girlfriend, and Anna stopped her analysis with Freud. Perhaps these two things prove the effectiveness of telepathy rather than psychoanalysis.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. I just was wondering, first of all, if you could give the people that accompany us today a sort of context of your own research, of all these readings you have done, of all these letters, because I think, well, in the book that you have written in Spanish, it comes really well how you have actually paid very detain attention to all these details and how these letters sort of superpose.
Yeah. It's astonishing. Yeah, very interesting.
Tell us a bit about, your own involvement in.
It is a pity that the correspondence doesn't exist in English, is in contradiction, no? It's because Anna Freud lives her life, entire life practically in England. So I don't know. But yes, there is a second part that I prefer drop it. Maybe another thing, another time.
Okay. So it's thank you very much, Juan Pablo, and just we will open a bit the
Yes, excuse me. There is the share the screen, very interesting.
Okay, yeah.
1 minute,
Go ahead.
minute. Partager. Minute, hein? 1 minute. You see that?
Yes, perfectly well.
Okay, so you must distinguish two different registers of fantasy. Imaginary fantasy, beautiful stories, so opera, so Bard subject, losange A, very different that is Miller that wrote like that. A subject, fundamental fantasy, a child is being beaten. Let's call it ugly story in opposition to the beautiful stories. So in a certain sense, it's clear for me that barrel subject, Lansange A, constitute a repression, is a repression of the fundamental fantasy. In this schema is used by Lacan in the seminar about transference, who you can see that you can put in one the ugly story, and in the two the non-narcissistic ideal ego and so on level the beautiful story. And you can see that at the purpose, the aim of Lacan in blue, the reserve libidinal. When can you translate reserva libidinal? The libidinal reserve. Yeah, in the sense of the libido. The libido that provoke, that cause, precisely causes the beautiful stories. You can see that in the mirror, in quote, so in the imagination, precisely. So it's not visible. It's not visible in the imagination. To that, there is a kind of repression here with this. And finally, the final reward, because you tolerate me. So it's in French, but it's more or less the same thing. So that's the graph du désir, donc graph of the desire. If we put, you must put here the belles histoires, beautiful stories, a kind of repression of what? Of the pulsional level. So pulsion d'être battu, donc a child is being beaten here. Because that is the description, the stuff of the pulsion for Lacan here. So and you can see that here for Lacan at least the fantasy, daydream fantasy, is the more or less the same thing that the ego, like imaginary construction. That's why the belles histoires, beautiful stories, is in congruence with the ego. So you can say like that in English, no? Congruence is the more or less the same register. So very different that the symbolic identification. Let's put it. I don't know. I don't know the unconscious of Anna Freud, but you can suppose more or less like that that there is an identification, symbolic identification with the father. I don't know. Maybe no. That is the idea of my talk. That's okay.
Thank you so much, Juan Pablo. We will then open a bit of an